bunker smelled like cold metal and old grief, and Sergeant Dara Voss had stopped noticing either a long time ago. She sat in the monitoring chair with her boots up on the console, watching the row of status lights blink green, 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 one for each of the 37 bodies suspended in their chambers along the south corridor. 37 humans, dead by every measure that had ever mattered, each one paying 8 figures a year to stay that way in the hopes that some future century would figure out how to bring them back. Her job was to make sure the machines kept them cold. His job was the same. Between them, they'd managed to make something else out of the arrangement. Tomas was on the far side of the monitoring room, standing at the secondary panel, not looking at her. He hadn't looked at her directly in 3 days, which was its own kind of communication. Outside, Sonora desert pressed against the bunker's reinforced skin. It was night, and the desert at night was a silence so total it felt pressurized. 22's temp drifted again, he said. I see it. 0.2 of a degree. I said I see it, Tomas. He keyed the adjustment manually rather than letting the system handle it, which was unnecessary and which he knew was unnecessary. She let him do it. There was a whole language between them built out of what they let each other do. Chamber 22 was him. Reginald Carver, 51 years old at time of suspension, made his money in logistics. Husband to the woman who'd hired Dara and Tomas as joint overseers of the facility. That was the word the contract used. Overseers. The woman herself, Miriam Carver, was alive somewhere in Scottsdale, checking in by encrypted message every quarter. Dara had never met her in person. The messages were polite and short and told her nothing about what it was like to put your husband in a freezer and pay strangers to stand guard over him. He looks wrong today, Tomas said. The feeds were live on every chamber. Dara swiveled her chair to face 22's screen. The body inside was pale to the point of translucence, the face slack in a way that living faces never managed. Hands folded across the chest by the technicians who'd prepared him. He looked like a man playing at being dead in a school play, except that no one playing dead ever got the complete absence of muscle tension right. The body in chamber 22 had it right. Looks the same, she said. I mean the color. On the display it's a shade off. She got up and looked at the raw sensor feed rather than the visual. He was correct. Not by much, not by anything a system alert would catch. But she'd spent 18 months in this bunker, and she knew the numbers for all 37 of them the way she knew the constellations her father made her memorize when she was 7. I'll log it and flag for the next technician visit, she said. Tomas was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you think it's like, being in there? Nothing. It's like nothing. That's the point. You don't think there's anything left in there? Any residue of him? She studied the body on the screen, the hands, the particular angle of the jaw. She thought about what Miriam Carver might see when she looked at this feed from her house in Scottsdale, if she ever looked. I think there's a man in there, she said carefully. I don't think there's much of a person anymore. And what's the difference? She was going to answer that when the proximity alarm went off. Not the internal alarm, not a breach in the climate systems or a power fluctuation. The external perimeter sensor. Something was on the surface. Dara was at the security panel in 3 strides. The desert around the facility was her second home. She knew its patterns, the thermal blooms of coyotes, the occasional signature of a lost hiker, the ATV tracks that sometimes came close before thinking better of it. She'd catalogued every shape the surveillance system had ever shown her. She was looking at now was not in her catalogue. The shape was roughly bipedal, but the thermal signature was wrong by a factor that made her check the calibration twice. Too cold for a mammal, far too large for a person. It was moving in the way water moves around a rock, not walking toward the facility so much as flowing around it. Testing, investigating its circumference in slow patient arcs. She muted the alarm before it woke the secondary system. Tomas. He came without asking why. She stepped aside so he could see the screen. She watched his face. Equipment ghost, he said. I've never had a ghost that size. Wildlife? Thermals 40 degrees below ambient. Nothing alive runs that cold. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through the same catalogue she'd worked through, coming up the same empty. "What do we do?" he asked. "We watch." They watched. Over the next 40 minutes was methodical. The shape completed 2 full circuits of the facility without approaching the entrance points. It paused for long intervals at the ventilation stacks, at the fuel cell housing, at the emergency egress tunnel that most people didn't know was there. That last pause lasted 11 minutes. "It knows the layout," Dara said. Tomas heard what she didn't say. It knew the layout without having gone inside. It was reading the structure the way you'd read a blueprint, from the outside, from what the structure exhaled. The electrical signatures, maybe. Atmosphere of the place. She made a decision. She went to the equipment locker and removed the emergency flect, the emergency beacon, and the portable Atmo scanner that the company had provided without any explanation of why a cryogenic facility in a desert would need an atmospheric analyzer. She'd asked once and been given an answer about due diligence that hadn't satisfied her. She understood the equipment better now. "I'm going topside." Tomas grabbed her arm. Not hard, just his hand on her forearm, which was as much as he ever permitted himself. "Dara, someone has to see it directly. That's not a reason to be the someone. We're the only 2 people here. One of us needs to stay with the chambers." She looked at the hand on her arm, not at him. "And you know the numbers better than I do." That was a lie. They both knew it. He knew she was lying and she knew he knew. She let the lie stand because there were things between them that couldn't be said plainly yet, and this was the shape of one of them. He let go of her arm. The access shaft was a 12-meter climb up a ladder that she'd made so many times she could do it in the dark, was how she made it now. She came up through the emergency hatch 300 meters from the main entrance, into air that hit like a wall. The desert night cold was a different animal than the artificial cold of the bunker. It moved, it had texture. She lay flat on the hatch cover for a moment and looked at the stars. Her father's constellations. Scorpius was overhead, hook of its tail pointing south. She brought up the Atmo scanner. The readout was extraordinary. Not in the direction of contamination or anomaly, extraordinary in the direction of absence. The local air, within a radius of perhaps 30 meters around her position, had been processed. Certain compounds were depleted, others elevated, patterns she couldn't identify but which clearly hadn't occurred naturally. Something had breathed this air and changed it, found the shape by its sound before she found it visually. It was not the sound of footsteps. It was more like the sound of a building settling, a low structural creak distributed across a wide area, as if something very large was choosing very carefully where to place its weight. She oriented toward it and kept still, and the shape resolved out of the darkness the way a figure resolves out of a puzzle image once you see it, all at once, and you wonder how you missed it. It was 12 feet tall at minimum, possibly more. Body was segmented in a way that vertebrate biology didn't produce, not insectile exactly, operating on a structural logic she didn't have a reference for. It had no visible head as such. The forward section of its body was where the concentration of its attention seemed to be, and that attention was currently focused on the eastern ventilation stack in a way she could only describe as contemplative. She did not run. She had thought, on the climb up, about what she would do if she actually found something, and she had concluded that the most dangerous thing she could do was move quickly, and the second most dangerous was to make a sound, and the third most dangerous was to let it get behind her without her knowledge. So she watched it, and it examined the ventilation stack. The desert was quiet between them. It was Tomas's voice in her earpiece that broke the stillness. Quiet, professionally calm, the voice he used when a chamber reading alarmed him. "Dara, I have movement on the internal sensors. Lower level, chamber corridor." She was moving before she'd decided to move. The climb back down the shaft took 45 seconds. She hit the bottom running, and she covered the distance to the chamber corridor in under a minute, and she came through the security door to find Tomas already there, standing in the middle of the corridor, and 3 of the chambers open. Not broken open, open. The seals released from the inside, which was architecturally impossible because the seals were electronic and the bodies inside them were disconnected from every system. Except they hadn't been. Not exactly. The sensors still ran. The sensors were still connected to the building's network, and the building's network had been read from outside, through the ventilation system, through the electrical signatures, through whatever sensory apparatus the thing on the surface used to map the world. 3 open chambers, chambers 4, 17, and 22. 22 was him, Reginald Carver. And the body in chamber 22 was not where it was supposed to be. She found him on the floor, not collapsed, arranged. The body of Reginald Carver was on the floor of the corridor, with the same neat folded hands, the same arranged posture, as if someone had carefully lifted him from his chamber and placed him with the same precision the original technicians had used. Temperature differential was already showing on his skin. He was thawing, not dead, not yet, not in the way that precluded the theoretical future rescue his wife was paying for, but closer. "We need to get him back in," Tomas said. "We need to figure out what opened the chambers first. Dara, if we put him back and something opens it again, we'll lose him. I need to know what we're dealing with." She pulled up the network logs on her tablet. The intrusion was elegant. Not crude, not a force breach. It was more like a conversation the building had with something that understood its language. The facility's monitoring network had transmitted its data, all of it in the normal course of its operation, via the cellular uplink that sent readings to the company's servers. Except that for the past 6 hours, those transmissions had also been received by something else. Something that had positioned itself within range and listened. And once it understood the language, the protocols, the authentication signatures, it had sent a reply. A single instruction, chamber release. Only 3, 4, 17, 22. She looked at the chamber roster on her tablet. Chamber 4, a 73-year-old woman, materials scientist. Chamber 17, a man in his 60s biochemist, formerly with a government research program. Chamber 22. Reginald Carver, logistics. No, not logistics. She read the full intake file for the first time, which she hadn't when she'd been hired, because reading the full files had seemed like a violation of something. Reginald Carver had made his money in logistics. Before that, he had spent 22 years as a program director for a non-public research initiative attached to an agency that the intake form named only by its internal designation. The woman in Chamber 4 had been his deputy. The man in Chamber 17 had been their chief scientist. She stood in the cold corridor, and the weight of it settled on her. "They're not customers," she said. Tomas was looking at the same file she was looking at. She could see it on his face. They're evidence," she said, "or they were, before they froze themselves." Evidence of what she didn't know. Evidence that something had already happened, maybe. Evidence that the thing on the surface had reason to be here specifically in this specifically for these 3 people, and not for the 34 others whose chambers it had left, sealed and untouched. She thought about Miriam Carver in her house in Scottsdale, sending polite short encrypted messages once a quarter. She thought about the shape in the desert, contemplating the ventilation stack with something she could only read as patience. It had not forced anything. It had listened and learned and asked. The chamber seals had opened because the system had received a valid, authenticated command. Technically, procedurally, legally, nothing had been broken. The building had said yes, and now 3 bodies were out of their chambers and 1 was thawing on the floor. And the thing that had done this was still outside, and Dara Voss was standing in the middle of all of it, trying to figure out what she was going to do. She made the decision the way she always made hard ones, not by thinking her way to the answer, but by recognizing which option she couldn't live. The reverse of. She could not live with putting Reginald Carver back in his chamber and waiting. "Help me with him," she said. "You just said, I know what I said. I changed my mind. We get him back in first, then we deal with what's outside." They lifted him together, the 2 of them, the dead weight of a man who had been cold for 3 years. His skin was the color and temperature of wax. His face was the school play face of someone playing dead who'd gotten the muscle tension exactly right. Dara's hands were under his shoulders and her face was 6 inches from his, and she thought, this man knew something, and that something is why that thing is outside, and I am never going to find out what it was. Maybe she didn't need to find out what it was to decide what to do about it. They sealed him back in. They did the same for the woman in 4 and the man in 17, both of whom had moved less than Carver. Lifted a few centimeters, touched, perhaps assessed, then replaced. Not damage, not theft. Examination. Tomas was running the network isolation protocol that would cut the cellular uplink, which would lock out the intrusion, but would also, incidentally, cut their own communication with the outside world. He looked at her before he ran it. She nodded. The uplink died. The building became an island. Now, he said, now we wait. They were waiting for. She wasn't sure she could have articulated. She went back to the security panel and watched the shape on the perimeter complete another circuit. It paused at the ventilation stack again. Then, and she had been watching carefully enough to mark the exact moment, it stopped, not stopped moving. Stopped in the way a person stops when they've understood something. The posture, if the thing could be said to have posture, changed. The weight distribution changed. The arcs of its slow investigation became still. It stayed still for 4 minutes. Then it produced something. She could see it on the thermal display, an object, held in whatever it used for hands, radiating at a different temperature than the rest of it. It placed the object at the base of the ventilation stack with the same precision the original technicians had used to fold Reginald Carver's hands. And then it walked away in the same flowing patient arcs, back out into the desert, and the thermal signature shrank and attenuated and eventually disappeared past the sensor range. It took her another hour before she went topside to retrieve the object. It was a cylinder, roughly 15 centimeters long, made of a material she couldn't identify. Not metal, not ceramic, not any polymer she'd handled before. It was warm to the touch in a way that seemed intrinsic, as if it generated its own heat. It was covered in a regular surface pattern that might have been structural and might have been text. Might have been both. Brought it down and set it on the console, and she and Tomas looked at it for a long time. "We should report this," he said. "To who?" He opened his mouth and closed it. "The company that employed us to watch bodies," she said. "Or the agency that the bodies used to work for. Or the government, which may or may not be the same thing as the agency." She turned the cylinders slowly in her hands. "Any of those options assumes someone in that chain is going to tell us the truth about what's going on and what this is." "You think they won't?" She thought about Miriam Carver and the polite quarterly messages. She thought about an intake form that listed Reginald Carver's previous employer as a designation rather than a name. She thought about why a cryogenic facility in a desert came with an atmospheric analyzer that no one had bothered to explain. "I think," she said slowly, "that we were hired to watch 3 specific people, and that whoever hired us knew this was possible, that they didn't tell us." Tomas was quiet. "I think the thing outside knew more about this facility than we did. And I think it came here with something to give rather than something to take. And I think that should mean something." "It means something to you," he said. "What does it mean?" She set the cylinder down on the console between the two of them and left her hand next to it but not on it. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I want to." Outside, the desert pressed against the bunker's skin. The chambers blinked green, green, green. Reginald Carver's temperature readings had stabilized at the correct value. All 37 bodies were accounted for, intact, their cold preserved against the slow disaster of time, and on the console, between a man and a woman who had made something out of the wrong materials in the wrong place, the cylinder sat warm and waited for them to learn its language. In the monitoring room, something that had been a simple arrangement began, slowly, to become something else. The choosing of it was in the way Tomas moved to stand beside her rather than across the console from her. Choosing of it was in the way Dara's hand finally closed around the cylinder. Not possessively, but the way you hold something you've decided to be responsible for. The lights blinked green. Desert was enormous and old and patient in exactly the way they were going to have to learn to be. She thought about her father and his constellations the way he'd said, "The map is not the territory. You don't navigate by memorizing the map. You navigate by understanding what the map is trying to tell you about the territory and knowing that the territory is always more." The cylinder was warm. She held it and she thought, what is this trying to tell me, and am I brave enough to hear it? Tomas's hand came to rest on her shoulder. Not a question. An answer to one she hadn't known she'd asked. Outside, somewhere past the sensor range, the shape that had come out of the desert was becoming one with the desert again, folding itself back into the dark. Patient and cold-blooded and careful. It had done what it came to do. It had left the evidence of itself, not in damage, not in theft, but in a gift that required the recipients to choose. It had read the building's language and spoken back in it. It had not come to take. It had come to exchange. Whether the exchange would be accepted was the question it had left behind with the cylinder. Sat warm on the console in a bunker in the Sonora Desert between two humans who were, in every way the situation demanded, exactly enough. The lights blinked green. The desert waited. Dara Voss made up her mind.